Jalen Carter hunched his shoulders against the sharp winter wind as he walked home from his shift at the local grocery store. The cold air stung his cheeks, and each breath left him a small, frosty cloud. His mind was elsewhere, occupied with thoughts of his unfinished homework, the looming college application deadlines, and the ever-present worry about how he'd pay for it all. Senior year had turned out to be as demanding as everyone warned, and even though he'd managed to keep his grades high, the scholarships he desperately needed seemed more out of reach each day. Lost in his thoughts, Jalen almost missed the unusual sight up ahead, a sleek, black luxury car idling by the curb, its hazard lights blinking against the fading evening light. As he got closer, he noticed a man stumbling out of the driver's seat, gripping his chest with a pained expression. The man's face was contorted, his breath shallow and quick. Jalen's instincts kicked in, overriding any hesitation or fear. "Sir? Are you okay?" he called, quickening his pace as he approached the man, his voice laced with growing panic. The man let out a strained groan and collapsed onto the icy pavement, his hands clutching at his chest. Without a second thought, Jalen dropped to his knees beside him, reaching into his pocket for his phone. His fingers were trembling as he dialed 911, his heart racing as fast as his mind. "911, what is your emergency?" The calm voice on the other end of the line brought a sliver of steadiness to Jalen's shaking hands. "There's a man here. I think he's having a heart attack," Jalen stammered, barely keeping his composure as he relayed their location. "Please, I need an ambulance. He just collapsed." The operator's voice remained calm as she guided him through CPR, step by step. Jalen's breath quickened as he placed his hands on the man's chest, pressing down with all the strength he could muster. He counted out loud, the rhythm steady but intense. Each compression felt like a lifeline, a desperate attempt to keep this stranger alive. The minutes dragged, feeling like an eternity. But he didn't stop, even as his arms started to ache and his own breath came in ragged gasps. Then, in the distance, the faint wail of sirens broke through the silence, growing louder until red and blue lights flashed against the buildings around him. Paramedics rushed to the scene, quickly taking over the CPR as Jalen stumbled back, exhausted and shaking. He watched in silence as they lifted the man, pale, unconscious, but still alive, onto a stretcher and loaded him into the ambulance. The doors closed, and as the ambulance pulled away, Jalen realized he hadn't even caught the man's name. He stood alone on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the chilly air, his heart still racing from the intensity of what had just happened. For a moment, he felt numb, almost as if he were in a dream. He couldn't shake the strange feeling that he had just crossed paths with someone in a way that would ripple through his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. Slowly, he started walking again, his mind replaying the scene over and over. He'd heard stories of people being in the right place at the right time, but he never thought he'd be one of them. As he walked home, a thought settled into his mind: he had made a difference tonight. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something bigger than he could imagine. Jalen woke up the next morning feeling as if he'd lived a week in a single night. The weight of the previous evening still pressed on his mind, each detail vivid: the cold air, the tension in his muscles as he performed CPR, the ambulance lights casting eerie shadows across the street. He replayed the events in his head, wondering who the man was and if he'd made it through the night. At breakfast, Jalen shared the story with his mom and younger sister, Tasha. His mom listened with her coffee cup paused midair, a look of both pride and worry etched on her face. "Jalen, you saved that man's life," she said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "Not everyone would have done what you did." Tasha, still in her pajamas, looked at her brother with wide eyes, her excitement bubbling over. "You're like a real-life hero, Shay," she exclaimed, grinning from ear to ear. Jalen laughed, trying to play down the praise. "I just did what anyone would have done. He needed help, so I helped." He shrugged. But inside, the feeling lingered, like an ember of pride he wasn't used to carrying. The day moved on, and Jalen slipped back into his usual routine, attending classes, catching up with friends, and focusing on his assignments. By the time school let out, the whole thing felt like a strange but distant memory. He almost believed that his life could go back to normal, that is, until a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb as he was leaving the school grounds. Jalen's stomach flipped as he eyed the car, its tinted windows glinting in the afternoon light. For a moment, he wondered if it was a coincidence. But his instincts told him otherwise. The passenger side window rolled down smoothly, revealing a man in a sharp suit with an air of authority that was hard to ignore. "You're Jalen Carter?" the man asked, his tone brisk, his expression all business. Jalen nodded, unsure of what to expect. "Yeah. Who's asking?" "I'm Mr. Johnson, Mr. Coleman's attorney," the man replied, inclining his head slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Coleman would like to meet you." Jalen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Mr. Coleman?" he repeated, the name finally giving shape to the mystery. "You mean the man from last night? He's okay." Johnson nodded, his expression unchanging. "Yes. Thanks to you. He'd like to express his gratitude personally. If you'd come with me?" Jalen hesitated, glancing back at the school and then at the sedan. Part of him felt wary. But the chance to see the man he had saved, and maybe even understand why it mattered so much to him, was impossible to ignore. He swallowed his nervousness and opened the car door, sliding into the plush leather seat. The interior was cool and smelled faintly of expensive cologne, a world away from the worn bus seats he usually took home. The drive through the city took him further from his neighborhood than he'd ever been. The streets gradually transformed from bustling urban blocks to sprawling, tree-lined avenues. As they approached a gated estate, Jalen's eyes widened at the towering mansion that loomed ahead. It was like stepping into another universe, one where the houses were the size of small hotels and the cars parked outside looked like they cost more than his family's entire savings. The sedan rolled to a stop, and Mr. Johnson led Jalen up a winding stone path to the front entrance. The doors opened into a grand hallway, where paintings and chandeliers lined the walls and ceiling, casting a golden glow over everything. Jalen's sneakers squeaked on the polished marble floor as they walked, and he couldn't help feeling out of place in his school clothes, surrounded by opulence he'd only seen in movies. Johnson led him into a dimly lit room lined with shelves of old, leather-bound books and a fireplace that crackled softly in the corner. By the fire sat Mr. Coleman, the man from last night, looking pale but very much alive. He was wrapped in a plush robe, his expression a mixture of curiosity and something harder to read, like he was sizing up a piece of rare art or a valuable stock. "You saved my life," Coleman said, breaking the silence with a voice that was hoarse yet commanding. Jalen shifted, suddenly feeling small under the man's intense gaze. I did what anyone would have done, sir." Coleman let out a short, humorless laugh. "No. Most people would have walked by, pretended not to see, or assumed it was someone else's problem." His voice carried a hint of bitterness, as if he'd seen the worst of people and come to expect it. "But you acted." Jalen didn't know how to respond. He felt a mix of pride and unease. Coleman's praise felt as cold as the icy street from the night before. He waited, unsure of where this conversation was going. Coleman leaned forward, his pale face catching the firelight. "I owe you," he said, the words clipped and formal. "And I'm not a man who leaves debts unpaid." Jalen opened his mouth to protest, but Coleman held up a hand, silencing him. "I have a proposition for you, young man, an internship at my company, Coleman Enterprises. I don't make offers like this lightly, but I see potential in you. Consider it my way of repaying you." The room fell silent, and Jalen's mind raced. Coleman Enterprises was one of the most influential corporations in the country, known for its aggressive success and reach. An internship that would be life-changing, an opportunity most people from his background would only dream of. Jalen swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "I don't know what to say," he stammered, caught between excitement and disbelief. "Say yes," Coleman replied, his gaze unwavering, his voice leaving little room for argument. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken implications. Jalen knew the magnitude of what he was being offered, the doors it could open, the path it could pave for his future. But as he looked into Coleman's calculating eyes, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of unease. Yet, the lure of opportunity, an escape from the life he'd always known, was too strong to ignore. Finally, he nodded. "Yes, sir?" Coleman's mouth lifted in the smallest hint of a smile. "Good," he said, his tone one of satisfied expectation. I'll see that arrangements are made. As Jalen left the mansion, he felt a strange blend of excitement and trepidation. The path ahead was uncertain, and though he couldn't quite shake the nagging feeling of stepping into unknown territory, he knew one thing: his life had just changed forever. Jalen woke early, adrenaline fueling him as he got dressed in his one good shirt and a tie his mother had helped him pick out the night before. Today wasn't just any day, it was his first day as an intern at Coleman Enterprises. The name alone carried weight. And now, standing in his bedroom, adjusting his tie with sweaty hands, it finally hit him that he was stepping into a world he had only glimpsed from the outside. When he arrived downtown, Jalen found himself staring up at the towering glass building that was Coleman Enterprises. Its windows gleamed in the morning sun, reflecting the busy city below, and the sheer scale of it made him feel small yet exhilarated. He walked through the large revolving doors and into a spacious lobby that bustled with people in suits, all of them moving with a sense of purpose and energy he had never experienced before. "Jalen Carter?" a voice called out, snapping him out of his trance. A young woman in a sleek black suit with an official-looking badge clipped to her blazer approached him, clipboard in hand. She looked like someone who belonged here, poised, sharp, and efficient. "Yes, that's me," Jalen replied, standing a bit straighter. "Welcome to Coleman Enterprises," she said with a small smile that was more polite than warm. "My name is Laura. I'll be showing you around today and introducing you to the team." Jalen nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and nerves. Laura led him through a maze of corridors, each more polished and professional than the last. He caught glimpses of conference rooms with walls made entirely of glass, filled with people in deep discussions or giving impressive presentations. The energy in the building was electric, driven by people who all seemed to know their exact place in the grand machine that was Coleman Enterprises. Finally, they reached the top floor, where the company's senior executives worked. Laura gestured for him to step into a sleek, modern office with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. It was intimidating but awe-inspiring. Here, decisions that impacted entire markets were made. Jalen could feel it in the air. "Your primary assignment will be to shadow Mr. Thomas and Ms. Myers," Laura explained, referring to two senior executives. "They handle strategic partnerships and corporate development, so you'll have a chance to see the core of what we do here." Jalen's heart beat faster at the thought. He'd gone from stocking shelves to being around people who negotiated deals worth millions, maybe billions. This was beyond what he could have imagined. The morning passed in a blur of introductions and handshakes, as Jalen met team members whose titles he could barely keep track of. Each introduction reminded him just how big a leap this internship was from his usual life. He noticed that people spoke with a certain urgency, always checking their watches or flipping through files, their focus intense. The fast pace was both intimidating and exhilarating, and he found himself wanting to rise to the challenge, to prove that he belonged here. After lunch, he had his first real task, sitting in on a strategic planning meeting with Ms. Myers, who was one of the most respected executives in the company. Her presence was commanding. She spoke with authority, dissecting market trends and evaluating potential business opportunities with the precision of a surgeon. Jalen was in awe, scribbling notes as she led the meeting, trying to absorb as much as he could. Midway through the meeting, Mr. Coleman made an appearance, stepping into the room with his usual air of authority. Conversations dropped to a respectful hush as he entered, and people straightened in their seats. Jalen felt the room's energy shift instantly, as though Coleman's presence demanded a heightened sense of discipline. He acknowledged Jalen with a brief nod, his gaze sharp and calculating, before taking a seat at the head of the table. Coleman listened to the discussions without a word, his eyes fixed on Ms. Myers and her team as they presented. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but unyielding, dissecting each idea with razor-sharp questions that left no room for error. "Why is this projection lower than anticipated?" he asked at one point, his tone smooth but cold. "Have we accounted for market disruptions in the third quarter? If we don't, this will be a costly misstep." Jalen watched in awe as the team scrambled to respond, providing answers with a mix of respect and tension. Coleman's intellect was undeniable, and Jalen could see why people both respected and feared him. He saw the charisma and confidence that had built Coleman Enterprises. But he also saw something darker, a ruthlessness, a demand for perfection that left little room for empathy. As the meeting ended, Coleman caught Jalen's eye for a moment. A brief but intense look that seemed to say, "Pay attention, this is how success is built." Jalen felt a chill run down his spine. There was power in this room. Power he'd never felt before. And it was both thrilling and unsettling. After the meeting, Laura met him in the hall. "How was that?" she asked. A slight smile on her face as though she knew exactly how overwhelming it must have been. "Incredible," Jalen said, struggling to find the words. "Mr. Coleman, he's demanding?" "Yes," Laura replied, nodding. "He expects the best from everyone. He built this company from the ground up. And he didn't get there by going easy on people. But if you work hard, there's a lot you can learn from him." Jalen nodded, filing her words away. He knew Coleman was tough. Maybe even intimidating. But the idea of learning from someone like him was more than enough motivation to keep going. He spent the rest of the day shadowing different teams, absorbing everything from financial analysis to marketing strategies, feeling like he was gaining years' worth of knowledge in just a few hours. As the day drew to a close, Jalen returned to his desk, a small, modest setup in a far corner of the office. He glanced around the bustling floor, feeling a sense of pride. He was part of this world now. A world he never imagined he'd be in. The work was hard, the expectations high. But he was determined to prove that he could keep up. For the first time, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something monumental. A future that stretched before him with possibilities he never dared to dream. When he finally packed up to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was on a new course. One he could barely understand but was eager to explore. He took one last look at the imposing building behind him, its glass walls glowing in the evening light, a symbol of power and success. As he headed home, he thought about his family, his neighborhood, and all the reasons he had to make this work. It was just the beginning. But Jalen knew he was stepping into a world that would test him in ways he hadn't even begun to imagine. The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of meetings, projects, and late nights. Jalen threw himself into his work, determined to learn everything he could. Each day, he followed Coleman Enterprises' senior executives through their routines, absorbing every detail. He had quickly learned that the corporate world moved at a relentless pace, and if he wanted to survive, he would have to keep up. One of the executives he shadowed, Ms. Myers, became an unspoken mentor to Jalen. She was meticulous and efficient, managing complex deals with precision and a calm that made her seem almost unshakable. Watching her work was like witnessing a master sculptor carve a masterpiece, every decision purposeful, every move calculated. She noticed Jalen's eagerness to learn and took him under her wing, giving him tasks that challenged him and pushed him to think critically. "Remember, Jalen," she said one afternoon as they reviewed a partnership proposal, "it's not about working harder. It's about working smarter. In business, time is money, and efficiency is everything." Jalen nodded, scribbling down notes. He admired her work ethic and her clear-eyed focus. She was the kind of leader he aspired to be, competent, respected, and, above all, fair. Under her guidance, he learned how to read financial statements, analyze market trends, and approach complex problems with a level of confidence that felt new to him. However, not all of his experiences at Coleman Enterprises were so inspiring. He was beginning to understand that the company was built not only on hard work but also on a ruthlessness that seemed almost second nature to its employees. No one exemplified this more than Mr. Coleman himself. He rarely showed up at the office. But when he did, his presence was electric, and the atmosphere in the building shifted immediately. One afternoon, Jalen found himself in a high-stakes meeting where Coleman had decided to make an appearance. The meeting involved a negotiation with a smaller company looking to partner with Coleman Enterprises on a new technology venture. Jalen was seated quietly at the back, trying to remain unnoticed. But he listened intently as Coleman led the discussion. The other executives were respectful, but Jalen could tell they were also wary, as if they were carefully treading around a predator. The representatives from the smaller company presented their pitch, outlining how their technology could revolutionize an industry Coleman Enterprises had recently expanded into. Jalen was impressed by their vision and passion. It was clear they had invested their hearts and souls into this project. But as he watched Coleman's expression, he could see that the man's interest was purely strategic. He saw no faces, Heard no personal stories, only numbers, figures, and potential profit margins. As the presentation ended, Coleman leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. So, he said, his voice smooth but cold, you're asking for a 25% share in the profits. Is that correct? The lead representative from the smaller company nodded, his face hopeful. Yes, sir. We believe this partnership will bring immense value to both of us. And we're excited to work with a company like Coleman Enterprises. Coleman's gaze hardened. 25% is generous, for you. But it doesn't work for us. A tense silence filled the room. The representative hesitated, a flicker of worry crossing his face. We've put everything into developing this technology, he replied carefully. Without our expertise, there wouldn't even be a project to discuss. Coleman didn't blink. Then I suggest you consider reducing your stake to 10%. Take it or leave it. The representative glanced at his team, clearly conflicted. Jalen watched, feeling a pang of sympathy for the smaller company. Their technology was remarkable, and they deserved a fair share. Yet Coleman's tone left no room for compromise. He was going to get what he wanted, regardless of the cost to others. Mr. Coleman, the representative started, his voice wavering. 10% is barely enough to cover our expenses. We'd be left with almost nothing. Coleman leaned forward, his eyes sharp as a blade. Then I suggest you cut your expenses, he replied curtly, his voice as icy as his gaze. This is a business, not a charity. If you want to make it in this industry, you'll learn to survive with less. Jalen felt a chill run down his spine. Coleman's words were ruthless, his tone devoid of empathy. He'd seen ambition before. But this was different. This was a level of coldness that he hadn't encountered. In that moment, he realized that Coleman's empire wasn't built on dreams or teamwork. It was built on power and control, on taking as much as possible and giving as little as necessary. After the meeting, Jalen caught up with Ms. Myers, his mind racing. Is he always like that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Myers glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. You're new here, Jalen, she replied, her tone neither approving nor disapproving. This is how deals get made. Coleman didn't build this empire by being nice. In business, nice doesn't win. Jalen absorbed her words, feeling a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. He understood now that Coleman's approach was one that demanded respect but sacrificed something essential in the process: decency, perhaps, or compassion. Yet everyone around him seemed to accept it as the natural order of things. As the weeks went on, Jalen continued to see this side of Coleman in different ways. He watched as entire departments were restructured, employees reassigned or dismissed without a second thought if their numbers didn't meet expectations. Coleman was efficient, brutal, and relentlessly focused on the bottom line. Jalen could see why he commanded respect, but the constant ruthlessness left him uneasy. One evening, as he was finishing up paperwork, he lingered at his desk, thinking about Coleman and the world he had entered. Part of him admired the man's success, his ability to command a room, to inspire a mixture of fear and respect. But another part of him wondered if this was the price of power, if getting to the top always required crushing others beneath you. As he packed up to leave, Ms. Myers passed by his desk. She paused, observing him for a moment before speaking. You've got potential, Jalen. I see it in the way you work, the questions you ask. But remember this, success in this world doesn't come cheap. If you want to make it here, you'll need to toughen up. Jalen looked at her, nodding slowly. Thanks, Ms. Myers. I appreciate the advice. But as he left the building, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his stomach. Was this the kind of success he truly wanted? Was power worth the price of losing compassion? The city lights twinkled around him as he walked to the bus stop, a mix of excitement and dread swirling inside him. The path he was on promised wealth, power, and status, but what would he have to give up to keep walking it? In the distance, the Coleman Enterprises building loomed, its glass facade reflecting the night sky. It was a beacon of success, a monument to one man's vision and ambition. And yet, as Jalen watched the building's lights flicker against the darkness, he couldn't help but wonder if he was staring not at a dream but at a cautionary tale. The days turned into weeks, and Jalen became more comfortable in his new role at Coleman Enterprises. He knew the layout of the building, the unspoken rules of the corporate world, and even some of the subtle dynamics between the executives. He'd adjusted to the relentless pace and learned to work around Coleman's exacting standards. He still felt conflicted about the ruthlessness he saw around him. But he told himself he was there to learn, and there was no doubt that he was learning a lot. Then one evening, after a long day of meetings and paperwork, Jalen was tidying up the conference room following an executive briefing. As he gathered his things, his gaze landed on a stack of files partially hidden under some loose papers on Coleman's desk. The top file was labeled Hollow Creek Project. The name meant nothing to him, but something about it drew him in. He looked around. The office was empty, and he was alone. Without thinking, Jalen stepped closer, curiosity overtaking caution. He told himself he was just straightening up, just taking a quick look. But as he flipped the file open, his pulse quickened. The file contained page after page of detailed reports, charts, and correspondence. It painted a picture of a project gone horribly wrong. Hollow Creek, he quickly gathered, was a small, rural community where Coleman Enterprises had purchased large tracts of land under the guise of revitalizing the area. Coleman had promised to bring jobs, build infrastructure, and inject life into the struggling town. But the reality was far from the promises made. Jalen read on, the words growing blurrier as the horror sank in. Instead of creating new opportunities, Coleman Enterprises had exploited the community, gutting the land for resources and leaving the area barren. Hollow Creek's residents had lost their homes, their jobs, and, in many cases, their savings, all because they believed in Coleman's promise of a brighter future. The development had been nothing more than a cover for a resource-stripping operation, leaving the community in ruins. He found letters from families, desperate pleas for assistance, and accounts from people who had been displaced, some of whom had lived in Hollow Creek for generations. As he read these personal accounts, he felt his stomach twist. Each letter told a story of loss and betrayal. People had put their trust in Coleman Enterprises, believing the company would make good on its promises. Instead, they were left with nothing. Jalen's hands shook as he turned the pages. He'd known Coleman was ruthless, that he didn't mind stepping on others to get what he wanted. But this was something far darker. Something that went beyond simple business tactics. It was destruction masquerading as progress. Exploitation dressed up as opportunity. His mind raced as he tried to process what he was reading. For weeks, he told himself that he could separate Coleman's methods from the knowledge he was gaining, that he could absorb the skills without letting Coleman's values taint him. But seeing the cost of those values so vividly spelled out shook him to his core. Jalen felt a surge of anger and betrayal. He had admired Coleman's success, had looked up to him as a symbol of what he could achieve if he worked hard enough. Now he saw the truth. Coleman's empire wasn't built on hard work alone. It was built on the backs of people like those in Hollow Creek, people who couldn't fight back, who were powerless against the sheer force of Coleman's ambition. Lost in thought, Jalen barely noticed the office door opening. He froze, heart pounding, as he looked up to see Coleman himself entering the room. The older man's sharp eyes flicked to the open file in Jalen's hands, and for a brief moment, his expression hardened. "What are you doing, Jalen?" Coleman's voice was low, almost casual, but there was a steely edge to it. Jalen closed the file, his fingers still trembling, and straightened up. I was just cleaning up and saw this." Coleman's gaze didn't waver. "And? You've read it, I assume?" Jalen swallowed, searching for the right words. "Yes, sir. I saw what happened in Hollow Creek." For a long moment, Coleman said nothing. Then, slowly, he walked over to his desk, taking the file from Jalen's hands and setting it back down. He folded his hands in front of him, his face unreadable. "That was business, Jalen," Coleman said finally, his tone dismissive. "It's the cost of doing what we do. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made for the greater good." "Sacrifices?" Jalen echoed, disbelief coloring his voice. "Those people, they lost everything. Their homes, their livelihoods. And you call that a sacrifice?" Coleman's expression tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Listen to me, Jalen," he said. his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If you want to succeed in this world, you need to understand that success doesn't come without hard choices. You think you can rise to the top by playing nice, by worrying about every small-town nobody? Jalen shook his head, a flash of anger breaking through his shock. But this wasn't just a hard choice. It was wrong. Those people trusted you. You promised them something better. And then you took it all away. Coleman's face remained impassive, his gaze hard and unyielding. You have potential, Jalen. But if you're going to question every decision I make, then maybe you're not cut out for this line of work. Think carefully. This is a rare opportunity I'm offering you. One that could change your life. But it comes with a price. And not everyone is willing to pay it. Jalen felt a chill settle over him. He had admired Coleman's power, had seen this internship as a way to secure a future for himself and his family. But now, that admiration was tainted. He could feel a line being drawn. A choice he had to make, a choice between the life he'd dreamed of and the values he'd grown up with. Coleman watched him closely, his gaze unwavering. You have a decision to make, Jalen. Either you're in, or you're out. I need people who are willing to do what's necessary to win, no matter the cost. If you're not one of them, then you can walk away now. Jalen looked down at the file, at the words and stories of the people who had lost everything because of one man's ambition. His mind flashed to his family, his mother, who had always taught him to do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. His sister, Tasha, who looked up to him and believed he could be someone worth admiring. And the families in Hollow Creek, who had believed in something that had been nothing more than a lie. After a long silence, Jalen looked up, meeting Coleman's gaze. He saw no regret there, no sense of responsibility or empathy, only cold, calculated indifference. Thank you, Mr. Coleman, Jalen said finally, his voice steady, for everything you've taught me. But I can't be part of this. Coleman's expression darkened, but he said nothing, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he watched Jalen. After a moment, he nodded, a cold smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Very well. Just remember, Jalen, you don't get far in this world by clinging to your ideals. Jalen didn't respond. He turned and walked out of the office, his heart heavy but his conscience clear. He didn't know what his future would hold. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't live with himself if he stayed. As he left the building for the last time, he looked up at the towering structure of Coleman Enterprises, its glass windows reflecting the evening sky. It was a symbol of success, of power, but to Jalen, it now looked hollow, built on the suffering of those who couldn't fight back. He walked away from the building, feeling a strange mix of loss and freedom. He had stepped away from a dream, but he was certain of one thing, he hadn't lost himself. And as he made his way home, he knew he would find another path forward, one that didn't require sacrificing his values. The night after Jalen left Coleman Enterprises, he lay awake in bed, his mind racing with emotions he couldn't easily untangle. The past few months had felt like a whirlwind of ambition, success, and admiration. Coleman Enterprises had promised him everything he thought he wanted, a future, respect, financial security. But it had come with a price, a cost that became unbearably clear as he'd uncovered the truth about Hollow Creek. Now, that image of success was shattered, replaced by a deep, painful clarity. Jalen's mind drifted back to his family. He thought about his mom, who'd raised him with a strict sense of integrity and resilience. She'd always told him to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. He remembered her words from years ago, after a neighborhood conflict had tested his sense of right and wrong. Integrity is the one thing no one can take from you, Jalen. Once you give it up, it's gone. The next morning, Jalen awoke to find his mom already up, making breakfast in the kitchen. The familiar smell of coffee and eggs filled the room, a comforting scent that seemed to ground him as he took a seat at the table. Unsure of how to start, she glanced over her shoulder and offered him a warm smile, but her gaze held a flicker of concern. Jalen, she began, her voice gentle but probing. You look like you didn't get much sleep. Jalen sighed, rubbing his temples. I didn't, Mom. A lot's been on my mind. She set down the spatula and turned to face him fully, her expression softening. What happened? Honey? Is it something to do with that job? Jalen took a deep breath. Yeah, it is. He told her everything about his experience at Coleman Enterprises, the intense work environment, the admiration he had for the company's power and influence, and finally, the files he'd stumbled upon, the truth about the Hollow Creek project. As he spoke, his mom listened in silence, her eyes never leaving him. He could see the hurt and disappointment in her expression, though not directed at him. When he finished, she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand over his. I'm proud of you, Jalen, she said softly. It takes courage to walk away from something so promising, especially when it goes against everything you thought you wanted. Jalen nodded, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. But I feel like I've lost everything. Mom, that job was supposed to be my way out. My way to help this family. And now, I don't know what to do. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady. You haven't lost everything, Jalen. You still have your integrity, your sense of right and wrong. Those are things no job or amount of money can replace. And as long as you have those, you'll always find a way forward. That conversation lingered with Jalen, giving him a renewed sense of purpose. He spent the next few days regrouping, contemplating what his next step should be. Despite everything, he knew that he couldn't simply go back to his old life as if nothing had changed. The experiences he'd gained at Coleman Enterprises, even the bitter lessons, had given him skills he never had before, and he realized he could use them in a way that mattered. One morning, he decided to visit the community center in his neighborhood, a place where he'd once volunteered before he got the internship. It was a small building, a bit worn around the edges, but it served as a hub for local efforts, providing food, classes, and support to families who were struggling. He hadn't been back in months, and the familiar faces welcomed him warmly. Jalen! Long time. No see. Mr. Adams, the community center director, greeted him with a broad smile. We thought Coleman Enterprises had stolen you away for good. Jalen chuckled, though there was a hint of sadness in his laughter. Yeah, I was there for a while. But I left. I realized it wasn't the right place for me. Mr. Adams gave him a knowing nod. That's okay. Son, sometimes you have to go through certain experiences to understand who you really are. So, what brings you back here? Jalen looked around the center, at the people working hard to make a difference in their community. I wanted to see if there's any way I could help out. I learned a lot at Coleman Enterprises: business strategies, financial planning, and negotiation. Maybe I can use those skills here for something that actually matters. Mr. Adams's face lit up. We could use that kind of knowledge. Jalen, the center has been trying to start a program to help local businesses get off the ground. But we've been struggling with funding and planning. Someone like you could make a real difference. Over the next few weeks, Jalen threw himself into his work at the community center, focusing on projects that helped small local businesses find their footing. He worked with aspiring entrepreneurs, teaching them about financial literacy, helping them navigate the world of loans and business plans, and even connecting them with resources he had discovered during his time at Coleman Enterprises. It felt fulfilling in a way that he hadn't felt during his internship. Each effort, each conversation, seemed to be a genuine step toward building something better. He also started to tell people about the Hollow Creek project, sharing the story of what Coleman Enterprises had done to that community. It wasn't long before the story started to circulate, gaining attention among locals who were eager to hold powerful corporations accountable for their actions. Jalen found himself speaking at local meetings, even rallying others who shared his commitment to prevent similar exploitation from happening in their own community. One day, as he was helping to organize a meeting, he received an unexpected call. The person on the other end introduced herself as a reporter from a local news station. Jalen Carter? She asked. I've heard you've been speaking out about Coleman Enterprises and the Hollow Creek project. Would you be willing to share your story on the record? Jalen hesitated. He knew speaking out publicly against Coleman was risky, but the idea of exposing the truth felt right. Yes, he replied, his voice firm. I'd be willing to share everything I know. A few days later, Jalen sat in front of the news camera, recounting his experiences with Coleman Enterprises and the hidden exploitation he had uncovered. He spoke about the promises Coleman had made to Hollow Creek and how those promises were broken, leaving families with nothing. He also shared his own journey, how he had been drawn in by the allure of success, only to realize that true success couldn't come at the expense of others. As the story aired, it sparked a wave of public outrage. People across the city began to question Coleman Enterprises' practices. And soon, officials were calling for investigations. For the first time, Coleman and his empire faced real scrutiny. And Jalen felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't anticipated. He had found his own way to make a difference. Not by rising to the top of a corporate ladder, but by standing up for what was right. In the following months, Jalen continued his work at the community center. The scandal surrounding Coleman Enterprises became a powerful example for others in the community. A reminder of what unchecked ambition and greed could do. Jalen's journey wasn't the path he'd originally envisioned, but it was one he was proud of. He had chosen to fight for something that mattered, to build a future grounded in integrity. As he walked through his neighborhood one evening, feeling the cool breeze of the city on his face, he realized that his journey was just beginning. There were still challenges ahead, and his path remained uncertain. But he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. For Jalen, the measure of success was no longer about wealth or power, it was about the difference he could make, the lives he could change, and the truth he could uphold. The weeks after Jalen's interview were filled with a new sense of purpose. His story about Coleman Enterprises and the Hollow Creek Project had sparked significant outrage, and he could feel the ripples of his decision spreading across the city. He watched as media outlets began digging deeper into Coleman's history, unearthing stories of other communities affected by his ruthless business practices. Local politicians began calling for reform, and it felt as though, for the first time, people were truly paying attention to the darker side of corporate power. But for Jalen, the most meaningful changes were happening closer to home. His work at the community center had become more than just a way to fill his days, it had transformed into a mission. He was now helping local small business owners, using the financial skills he had picked up at Coleman Enterprises to guide them through the complexities of securing loans, drafting business plans, and understanding market dynamics. He saw firsthand how these efforts could uplift his community, and it filled him with a sense of accomplishment he hadn't felt at Coleman Enterprises. One evening, after finishing a workshop on business fundamentals, Jalen sat with Mr. Adams, the director of the community center. Mr. Adams had become both a mentor and a friend, offering Jalen advice and insight as he navigated his newfound path. They sat on a bench outside the center, watching the sun set over the neighborhood they both loved. "You know, Jalen," Mr. Adams began, his voice thoughtful, "what you're doing here is powerful. These people trust you. They see you as one of them. Someone who's gone through the same struggles. That kind of connection, money can't buy it." Jalen nodded, gazing down the street, where a few children were playing a game of basketball, their laughter filling the air. "It feels different here," he said, choosing his words carefully. "At Coleman, I was learning skills. Sure. But it always felt like something was missing. Like everything was just a transaction." Mr. Adams smiled knowingly. "That's because in places like Coleman Enterprises, the bottom line is all that matters. But here, in your own community, you're dealing with people's lives, their dreams. That's something you can't put a price on." As the words settled over him, Jalen realized that this was exactly why he had walked away from Coleman Enterprises. It wasn't just about refusing to compromise his values, it was about finding something more meaningful, something that gave him purpose beyond his own ambition. The community center's business program had grown quickly, attracting residents from across the city. Jalen's work had caught the attention of local nonprofits and organizations focused on economic development, and he was soon invited to collaborate on larger initiatives. He found himself presenting at town hall meetings, sharing his story of Hollow Creek, and speaking out about the importance of ethical business practices. He felt both nervous and exhilarated, as if he were finally stepping into a role he was meant to fill. One night, after an especially successful meeting, Jalen received an unexpected call. It was from Ms. Myers, the executive at Coleman Enterprises who had served as a mentor during his internship. Her voice, though professional, carried a note of warmth that surprised him. "Jalen," she began, "I've been following your work. You've made quite an impression on the community." Jalen felt a surge of pride, mixed with a hint of surprise. "Thank you, Ms. Myers. I didn't expect to hear from anyone at Coleman after I left. Ms. Myers paused, choosing her words carefully. I wanted you to know that what you're doing is commendable. Not everyone would have had the courage to speak out the way you did. I know Coleman's methods aren't easy to reconcile, and I admire your decision to follow your conscience. Jalen was silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. It meant something to him that she had reached out, that someone from that world had recognized his choice. Thank you, he replied finally. It wasn't easy to leave, but I knew it was the right thing to do. Well, Ms. Myers said, her tone softening, I wanted to let you know that if you ever decide to come back, if there's ever a project or a role that aligns with your values, I'll do what I can to help you. There are people at Coleman who want to make a difference too, even if it's not always obvious. The call left Jalen with mixed feelings. It was comforting to know he had support, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his future lay elsewhere, beyond the walls of a corporate office. He thanked Ms. Myers, appreciating her gesture, but he knew he wouldn't be returning to Coleman Enterprises. His path had shifted, and there was no going back. In the following weeks, Jalen's work gained even more traction. He became a trusted advisor to local entrepreneurs, many of whom came from backgrounds similar to his own. The media continued to cover his story, and he began receiving messages from young people inspired by his journey. People who saw in him a role model who had stood up for what he believed in. He felt the weight of that responsibility, and it strengthened his resolve to keep pushing for change. Then, one day, he received an invitation from a group of city officials who were forming a task force to promote ethical business practices in underserved communities. They wanted him to be a part of it, to help shape policies that would protect vulnerable communities from the kind of exploitation he had witnessed in Hollow Creek. Jalen was thrilled and accepted without hesitation. At the task force's first meeting, he stood among politicians, business leaders, and community advocates, realizing that his journey had taken him to a place he never would have imagined. They discussed strategies to support struggling neighborhoods, ensuring that companies couldn't make empty promises or strip resources without accountability. Jalen shared his insights, drawing from his experiences at Coleman Enterprises and his work at the community center. As he spoke, he felt the power of his words and saw the impact they had on the people in the room. Here, in this space, he was more than just an intern or a student. He was a voice for change, a catalyst for something greater. He understood now that he could use the knowledge he'd gained at Coleman not just for personal gain but to protect others, to empower his community, and to create a legacy of integrity. At the end of the meeting, as he left the city hall, he paused to look out over the bustling city streets. He thought of the path he had walked, the choices he had made, and the dreams he still held. His journey was far from over, but he was on the right path, a path that didn't require him to sacrifice his morals or betray his values. That night, Jalen returned home feeling more certain than ever about his future. He had turned away from a world of power and wealth, and in doing so, he had found something far more valuable. He had found his purpose, his voice, and his commitment to building a world where success didn't come at the cost of others. As he drifted off to sleep, he knew that his story was only beginning, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead with his integrity intact and his heart in the right place. Jalen woke up early, his mind already buzzing with ideas. It had been months since he left Coleman Enterprises, and while the experience was still fresh in his memory, he had found himself growing into a new role, one that felt truer to his values and aspirations. He spent his days at the community center and with the city's task force, working to support small businesses and advocate for ethical practices in their local economy. The work felt meaningful. Like every task he completed was part of a larger purpose. He arrived at the community center that morning to find it busier than usual. People from all over the neighborhood were gathered in the lobby, sharing stories over coffee and signing up for new classes. Jalen loved the energy, the way people came together here, uniting over shared goals and dreams. Mr. Adams, the community center's director, caught Jalen's eye from across the room and waved him over. "Morning, Jalen," Mr. Adams greeted, a wide smile spreading across his face. "We're just about ready to launch the small business initiative today, thanks to your help." Jalen's eyes brightened. They'd been working on this initiative for weeks, developing workshops, securing resources, and gathering local business owners to provide mentorship. The program was designed to give aspiring entrepreneurs the skills and support they needed to succeed, something Jalen knew firsthand could change lives. It felt surreal to see their ideas finally coming to life. "We couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Adams," Jalen replied, feeling a surge of pride. "I'm just glad to be part of it." Mr. Adams patted him on the shoulder. "You're doing good work, Jalen. Real work. You're giving people a chance to build something of their own." As the day unfolded, Jalen led the first workshop in the new initiative, teaching a class on business fundamentals. The room was packed with people of all ages, from young adults to older members of the community, each eager to learn. Jalen felt nervous at first, but as he began speaking, his confidence grew. He explained how to create a basic business plan, covered the importance of budgeting, and even shared negotiation techniques he'd learned at Coleman Enterprises. He could see the excitement in his students' faces, the way they scribbled down notes and asked questions with genuine interest. By the time he wrapped up, Jalen felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time, he understood the impact he was making on others, and it was a feeling unlike anything he'd experienced at Coleman. Here, his knowledge wasn't just helping a corporation's bottom line, it was empowering people who wanted to lift themselves up. After the workshop, he stayed to speak one-on-one with several attendees. One of them was Mrs. Hernandez, a single mother of two who ran a small bakery out of her home. She'd been struggling to grow her business, and Jalen had been working with her over the past few weeks to secure a loan and find a permanent location for her shop. "Thank you, Jalen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been dreaming of this for years, but I didn't know where to start. I can't believe it's finally happening." Jalen smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude. "You did this, Mrs. Hernandez. You had the vision, you just needed a little support." Their conversation was interrupted by a small group of people who had gathered around them. Word had spread quickly, and people were eager to share their own ideas and seek advice. Jalen realized, somewhat humbly, that he had become a trusted figure in his community, someone people turned to for guidance. It was a role he'd never anticipated, but he embraced it fully. As the afternoon turned into evening, Jalen walked to City Hall for a meeting with the task force. The group had made significant progress in developing policies that would hold corporations accountable for their actions within underserved communities. They were drafting guidelines that would require transparency in corporate promises, ensuring that companies couldn't exploit vulnerable neighborhoods under the guise of development. The task force meetings were challenging. Jalen found himself debating with seasoned politicians, corporate lawyers, and economic experts. But he was determined to make sure that the truth about places like Hollow Creek was heard, and his passion became his strength in those meetings. During this particular session, one of the city officials, Councilwoman Anderson, brought up a recent corporate proposal to revitalize a neighborhood that had been struggling for years. The corporation behind it had promised jobs and infrastructure, much like Coleman Enterprises had once promised Hollow Creek. Jalen immediately felt a surge of skepticism, and he raised his hand to speak. "With all due respect, Councilwoman," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I've seen what happens when companies promise the world to vulnerable communities. They arrive with big words and high hopes. But if there's no accountability, those promises vanish, leaving the people worse off than before." Councilwoman Anderson nodded thoughtfully, clearly taking his words seriously. "I appreciate your perspective. Jalen, what do you suggest we do to prevent this from happening here?" Jalen took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need transparency, clear, binding commitments. If a company promises jobs, then it needs to guarantee them, maybe even by setting aside funds in advance or securing partnerships with local businesses. And if they don't follow through, there need to be consequences." The room fell silent as his proposal sank in. A few of the officials exchanged glances, and Jalen could see that his words had struck a chord. Councilwoman Anderson gave him a nod of approval. "That's an excellent point, Jalen. I think we should look into adding those requirements to the proposal," she said, making a note in her folder. "We need voices like yours on this task force, reminding us of the real impact these decisions have." As the meeting wrapped up, Jalen felt a sense of pride. He had come a long way from the young man who had once idolized Coleman's success without understanding its true cost. Now, he was working to ensure that others wouldn't have to face the same betrayal he'd witnessed at Hollow Creek. He was shaping policies that would protect his community, using everything he'd learned to build something meaningful. On his way home, Jalen reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him here. He thought of the young man he'd been on his first day at Coleman Enterprises, eager and hopeful, willing to do whatever it took to succeed. But now, he understood that success wasn't about wealth or status, it was about the lives he could change, the people he could empower. As he walked through his neighborhood, he noticed familiar faces, people who had come to his workshops, business owners he had advised, children playing outside the community center he helped support. He felt a deep sense of connection, a realization that he was part of something larger than himself. He had found a path that wasn't just about his own future but about the future of everyone around him. When he finally arrived home, Jalen sat at his kitchen table, reviewing his notes from the day. He was exhausted, but it was the kind of exhaustion that felt fulfilling, like he was truly making a difference. He looked over the list of people who had signed up for his next workshop, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He was building something that would last, something that would give others the opportunities he had once dreamed of. As the night settled around him, Jalen knew he had chosen the right path. It wasn't easy, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but he felt ready for whatever came next, knowing that he would face it with integrity, compassion, and a commitment to change. He had started this journey in search of success, but he'd found something far more valuable. He had found a purpose, and as he sat in the quiet of his home, he knew that was the greatest success he could ever achieve. Months passed, and Jalen's life continued to take shape in ways he had never anticipated. His work at the community center had grown, and his position on the city's task force had established him as a respected advocate for his community. Each day, he saw the difference he was making, not just in his own life but in the lives of those around him. The values he'd been raised with, integrity, resilience, empathy, had become the foundation of his work and, ultimately, his legacy. The small business initiative at the community center had blossomed beyond anything he'd imagined. Mrs. Hernandez had opened her bakery in a cozy storefront just down the street, and Jalen couldn't help but feel proud every time he walked by, seeing the smiling customers lining up for her fresh baked goods. Other entrepreneurs had begun to see success too. A mechanic had finally expanded his business. A young designer had launched a clothing brand, and a couple with a shared passion for healthy living had opened a smoothie bar. These businesses became not just sources of income, but pillars of the community, places where people gathered, shared stories, and found a sense of belonging. One evening, Jalen attended a grand opening celebration at Mrs. Hernandez's bakery. The smell of fresh pastries filled the air as families and friends crowded the small shop, congratulating her on her achievement. Jalen was there with his mother and younger sister, Tasha, who beamed with pride as she watched her brother being hugged, thanked, and praised by so many of the community members. For the first time, Tasha truly saw the impact her brother had made. "You're amazing, Jay," Tasha whispered, giving him a tight hug. "You've done so much for everyone. They're all here because of you." Jalen chuckled, his heart swelling. "It's not just me, Tasha. They put in the work. I just helped show them the way." As he spoke, Mrs. Hernandez came over, her eyes glistening with gratitude. She clasped his hands in hers, her voice thick with emotion. "Jalen, I can never thank you enough. This bakery, it's been my dream since I was young, and you helped make it real." Jalen smiled warmly. "It was always in you, Mrs. Hernandez. I just gave you a few tools to make it happen. This is all you." The celebration filled Jalen with a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. He had once thought that success was about personal achievement, about standing on his own. But now he understood it was about lifting others up, creating opportunities, and building something that would last long after he was gone. As the weeks passed, Jalen's work with the task force continued to evolve. They had successfully drafted policies that required corporate transparency when working with vulnerable communities, ensuring that promises made by large corporations would have to be honored. Jalen had been instrumental in shaping these policies, drawing on his experience with Coleman Enterprises and his first-hand knowledge of Hollow Creek's tragedy. His story had become a case study, a lesson in corporate responsibility and the power of accountability. One day, Jalen received an unexpected letter from a college in the city. His work had drawn the attention of local universities, and this one was offering him a scholarship to study business and community development, a program focused on ethical leadership. He was surprised, feeling a mix of excitement and disbelief. College had always been a dream, but the means to get there had seemed out of reach. Now, through his own path and choices, he had created an opportunity for himself, one that aligned with the values he held dear. Jalen's mother cried tears of pride when he told her the news. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself," she said, hugging him tightly. "You've become a man with a heart and a mission. Jalen, that's worth more than any success on paper." As he prepared to start college, Jalen found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the young man he had been, full of ambition and admiration for Coleman, yet unaware of the cost that such success demanded. He had walked away from that life, choosing instead to forge his own path, one that aligned with his sense of integrity and compassion. On the first day of classes, Jalen entered the campus with a renewed sense of purpose. He was there not only to learn but to share his experiences, to connect with others who believed in building a better world through ethical practices. As he sat down in his first lecture on community development, he felt a surge of gratitude for the path he had chosen. He knew it wouldn't be easy, there would always be challenges. People who prioritized profit over people, and systems that needed reform. But he was ready to face it all, knowing he had something more valuable than wealth or status, a vision for change. As his first semester unfolded, Jalen became known as a passionate advocate, an inspiring figure among his classmates. His story of Hollow Creek and the decisions he made at Coleman Enterprises resonated deeply with others, many of whom were disillusioned with corporate culture and eager for a new approach to business. Jalen led discussions, organized study groups, and became a mentor to students who shared his vision of ethical success. One day, as he was wrapping up a study session, a professor approached him with a proposal. She was putting together a research project on corporate ethics and community impact and wanted Jalen to co-author it with her. She believed that his experience and insights would add a powerful, real-world perspective to the study. Jalen was thrilled by the opportunity. He had never considered himself a writer or a scholar, but he saw the project as a chance to document his journey and share the lessons he'd learned. Together, he and the professor pored over research, examined case studies, and outlined a framework for corporate responsibility that prioritized community well-being over unchecked profit. It was a long, challenging process, but by the end of the semester, they had a comprehensive paper that had the potential to influence real change. The paper was published in a local journal, drawing attention from business leaders, policymakers, and activists across the city. Jalen's name was now associated not only with community advocacy but with a model for ethical leadership. People began reaching out to him, asking for his advice, wanting to know more about his journey, his vision, his values. Through all of this, Jalen remained grounded, visiting the community center regularly and staying connected with the people he'd helped. He knew that his success wasn't just about what he achieved for himself, it was about the legacy he was building in his neighborhood. A legacy of integrity and compassion that would inspire others long after he was gone. One evening, as he walked home from the community center, Jalen looked around at the neighborhood he'd known all his life. The faces of friends and neighbors, the laughter of children playing, the aroma of Mrs. Hernandez's bakery, it was all part of the world he dedicated himself to supporting and improving. Jalen had set out seeking success, but he'd discovered something far more meaningful, a purpose that transcended wealth and fame. His life had become a testament to the values he held dear, a story of integrity and resilience that would continue to inspire others for generations to come. And as he stood on that familiar street corner, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had become the man he wanted to be, not the one who rose to the top by any means necessary, but the one who had lifted others up, who had found his place by staying true to his values. In that moment, Jalen knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. His journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Confident in the legacy he was building, a legacy that would shine brightly, rooted in compassion, and strengthened by the courage to choose integrity over ambition.